Have you ever noticed how easily powerful symbols can override critical thinking? Whether it's a red hat with white text, a religious relic, or even the image of an empty tomb, symbols grab our emotions and tell us what to feel before we've even had a chance to think. And then, when people stop asking questions, when they accept fantastic claims just because they've been told to, it gets harder to separate truth from myth and healthy faith from harmful manipulation. Welcome to Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be taking a look at 3 readings from the Christian Bible through the lens of sacred myth. As we reflect on the readings for Easter Sunday, we're going to look beyond the supernatural claim that Jesus rose from the dead and ask a more important question. Why is that story so powerful, and how is it being used today? In this episode, we'll talk about the emotional pull of symbols, the importance of staying grounded in our values, and the critical role that evidence and reason have to play in shaping our beliefs, especially in a world where facts are constantly under attack. So let's dig in. Let's think more deeply about the stories we've inherited. Let's stay alert to the ways we're influenced by emotion, culture, and symbolism. Because if we want to build a better world, we can't do it with slogans and superstition. We need clarity, compassion, and critical thinking. So grab a comfy seat, a glass of your favorite beverage, and let's look at some ancient stories together in this edition of Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be exploring the readings for Easter Sunday, Cycle C of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. In this series, we're exploring readings from the Bible through the lens of sacred myth, looking for interpretations and lessons that don't demand a belief in the supernatural. What that means from a practical standpoint is that we will assume that these stories and writings are fiction, written by pre-scientific people who are just trying to make sense of the universe. Now, you might agree with the lessons I find, but I encourage you to look for something that rings true to you. Part of the beauty of understanding these writings as sacred myths is that we're free to interpret them for ourselves. We're free to learn the lessons that we need right now. So with that, let's dive in. As I said, tonight we'll be looking at the readings for Easter Sunday, Cycle C. Our first reading is from Acts of the Apostles. It's chapter 10, verses 34a and 37 through 43. Our second reading is from the letter to the Colossians. It's chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. And our gospel reading is from John. It's chapter 20, verses 1 through 9. Now, we'll start by going through all 3 of the readings. Then we'll look for the messages and the main lesson in each one. Finally, we'll bring everything together, look at what it means for us today, and talk about where we go from here. So with that, let's begin. Our first reading is from Acts of the Apostles. Then Peter began to speak. You know what has happened throughout the province of Judea, beginning in Galilee, after the baptism that John preached, how God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and power, and how he went around doing good and healing all who were under the power of the devil, because God was with him. We are witnesses of everything he did in the country of the Jews and in Jerusalem. They killed him by hanging him on a cross, but God raised him from the dead on the 3rd day and caused him to be seen. He was not seen by all the people, but by witnesses whom God had already chosen, by us who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. He commanded us to preach to the people and to testify that he is the one whom God appointed as judge of the living and the dead. All the prophets testify about him that everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins through his name. Our second reading is from the letter to the Colossians. Brothers and sisters, since then you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. And our gospel reading is from John. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. All right, so let's go back and take a bit of a critical look at these readings and see what learnings and lessons we can find if we dig around just a little bit. So our first reading was from Acts of the Apostles. And when we hear this passage, it's important to understand that we're not listening to a historical account. We're listening to a carefully crafted speech designed to stir belief, to build unity, and frankly, to justify authority. The author, writing decades after the alleged event, puts these words in Peter's mouth to summarize the entire Jesus story, the mission, the execution, and the resurrection. And here's the real kicker. He doesn't just tell a story. He frames the cross, a Roman torture device, as a symbol of triumph. That's a powerful shift. It reframes suffering and death as victory and purpose. And it's not just theological spin. It really is a textbook example of how symbols are used to influence emotion and to reinforce identity. Think about it. Over the centuries, the cross became more than a reminder of crucifixion. It becomes a brand, a rallying point. Even jewelry. We've seen it happen with other symbols too, right? The fish on cars, the swastika got co-opted for hate. The swastika was originally the sign and seal of the Buddha's heart. The rainbow was reclaimed for pride and inclusion, right? Symbols get layered with meaning, and those meanings can change over time depending on who's using them and how they're being used. When we strip away the supernatural claims of resurrection and divine appointment, what's left here is a story being strategically told in order to claim legitimacy. It's not a bad thing to use a story or a symbol to inspire people, but it does mean we need to stay conscious of how these tools are being used. This reading gives us a good reminder. It's easy to let symbols guide our emotions without pausing to think. But if a symbol makes us feel something, hope, fear, pride, disgust, it's worth asking why. Who benefits? Right? What narrative is being pushed? And is it in line with the values we actually believe in? Anyway, the main lesson I got from our first reading is that symbols are powerful emotional tools. Whether we're talking about ancient religious imagery or modern logos and flags, we can't forget how powerful symbols really are. They speak to our hearts before we even get a chance to engage our minds. It's not necessarily bad, but it means we should be using them wisely, and we should definitely pay attention when others are using symbols, because symbols are powerful emotional tools. Our second reading was from the letter to the Colossians, and this short reading urges believers to set your minds on things above. And while that's a religious reference in the original text, there's a very human message we can draw from it. Paul was speaking to early Christians who were just waiting anxiously for Jesus to return, like any day now. And Paul's job was to keep them focused and faithful. So he tells them to shift their mindset away from everyday worries and instead focus on what he calls heavenly things. Now, in practical terms, he's encouraging them to stay connected to a sense of purpose, to something bigger than their moment-to-moment concerns. Now, when we strip out the supernatural context, well, what we're left with is still useful advice, because honestly, it's way too easy to get just lost in the weeds of daily life. Bills, deadlines, social media doom scrolling, and all the little dramas that just eat up your energy every day. And when that happens, we risk drifting away from our bigger goals and sometimes even from our core values. This reading nudges us to pause and ask, what are we really working toward? What do we want our lives to stand for, ultimately? It's not about ignoring the here and now, but it's rather about making sure our daily choices are in service of something bigger. Maybe it's something more meaningful. And that meaning doesn't have to come from religion. It can come from wanting to leave the world better than we found it. It can come from being a good parent, or from just trying to be a kinder, wiser, more compassionate version of ourselves. Greater things don't always mean grand or spiritual. In fact, they just mean intentional. And that's something we can all practice, no matter what we believe. So the main lesson I got from our second reading is that it's important to be mindful of greater things. Now, this reading might have been written to keep early Christians focused on that expected second coming, but the real world humanistic takeaway is something all of us can use. When we keep our minds on what really matters and our values, maybe a larger purpose, our bigger vision for our lives, it gets easier to stay grounded and make choices that move us forward and move us toward that bigger vision. So yes, it's important to be mindful of greater things. Okay, our final reading was from the Gospel of John. And this reading it's often presented as one of the key proofs of the resurrection. But if you actually read it carefully, it paints a very different picture. Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb alone, finds it empty, and assumes, logically, that someone took the body. She doesn't immediately leap to supernatural conclusions. She reacts like most of us would if we found a grave disturbed. She runs to tell Simon Peter, and then Peter and another disciple rush to the scene, not because they expect a miracle, but because something clearly isn't right. Their reaction isn't joy, it's confusion. And that's what makes this reading so important when we strip away the religious framing. These aren't people confidently proclaiming, "He is risen." These are people looking for answers. They're searching for evidence. Even the so-called moment of belief, right, when the other disciples saw and believed, is ambiguous at best. Believed what? That Jesus had risen? That Mary was right about the body being gone? Even the author of the gospel admits they still didn't understand what was supposed to have happened. So it's not a triumphant declaration of truth. If anything, it's the beginning of a mystery. And if we're honest, that's actually far more relatable. Because when someone makes a fantastic claim, whether it's about miracles, conspiracy theories, or even just everyday decisions that affect our lives, it's not only reasonable to ask for evidence, it's necessary. This story reminds us that asking questions is not a lack of faith, it's a mark of integrity. If something is true, it should be able to stand up to a little honest scrutiny. And if it can't, then we need to pause before accepting it as a fact. Truth isn't afraid of questions. In fact, truth requires them. So the main lesson I got from our gospel reading is that we should ask questions and demand legitimate evidence to support fantastic claims. So while this passage is often held up as a foundational proof of the resurrection, what it really offers, if we look closely, is something even more valuable. A reminder to look for evidence, to ask questions, and to never settle for stories just because they're well told. That's not doubt, that's discernment. And in today's world, it's more important than ever. We should ask questions and demand legitimate evidence to support fantastic claims. All right, let's review the lessons we've talked about so far. In our first reading from Acts of the Apostles, the main lesson I came away with was symbols are powerful emotional tools. In our second reading from Colossians, the main lesson I got was it's important to be mindful of greater things. And finally, the main lesson I got from our gospel reading was we should ask questions and demand legitimate evidence to support fantastic claims. Look, we're living in a time when emotion-driven narratives and powerful symbols are being used to manipulate, distract, and divide us. And it's working. People are waving flags, quoting slogans, and clinging to stories without stopping to ask if any of it is actually true. That's why it's more important than ever to engage both our hearts and our minds. Yes, symbols are powerful, and they can be used for good, but only if we stay grounded in reality. That means keeping our eyes on the bigger picture. It means staying rooted in values that truly matter and refusing to accept extraordinary claims without evidence. Being mindful of greater things isn't just about faith or hope. It's about staying sharp in a world full of noise. And if we want a better future, we can't build it on stories alone. We need facts, reason, and a clear moral compass. So let's step back and take another look at these readings overall and see if we can figure out what these lessons really mean to us in our daily lives. To do this, I'll try to answer two questions. So what? And now what? Okay, so what? Why should we care about any of this? Well, we should care about this because we're watching right now as people try to drag the modern world backward using nothing but ancient stories and emotionally charged symbols. They don't ask for evidence, they don't test their beliefs, and they certainly don't stop to think about how their actions affect anyone outside their bubble. And unfortunately, they're not just talking. They're legislating. They're enforcing. They're trying to reshape society based on dogma that doesn't hold up to even basic scrutiny. That's a problem. This is important because when we stop asking questions, we stop progressing. The moment we accept, because the Bible says so, as a legitimate reason for laws or leadership decisions, we've left the world of reason and entered the world of authoritarian control. If we want a future rooted in equality and fairness, we can't build it on untested beliefs. We have to demand evidence, not because we're cynical, but because we care about the truth. We should care about this because we need to recognize how symbols are being used, not just in religion, but in politics, in media, in different movements that are constantly taking shape. Whether it's a cross, a flag, or a hashtag, these symbols can bypass logic and appeal directly to emotion. It's not always bad, but it is dangerous when it's being used to shut down critical thinking or manipulate people into fear and anger. This is important because there's actually a lot of good stuff we can hold on to from these old traditions. If we're willing to do what Paul actually said in 1 Thessalonians, test everything and hold on to what is good, that means letting go of the harmful, the irrational, the unjust. It means building something better out of the values that still stand strong, values that stand on their own merit, values like compassion, justice, community, forgiveness. Those don't need to come with a side of supernatural claims. We should care about this because what's happening right now affects real people in real time. Christian nationalism isn't just bad theology. It's bad policy. It's hurting communities. It's threatening democracy. It's trying to replace shared civic values with sectarian control. The world they're trying to build is not a world where everyone thrives. So if we want something better, we have to build it with eyes open, with our feet well grounded, and with voices that are willing to speak the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. And the last question I try to answer is, now what? What are we supposed to do? Where do we go from here? Well, one of the big takeaways from this episode is that symbols aren't just visual decorations. They're emotional shortcuts, right? Whether it's a flag, a cross, a rainbow, or a red hat with white letters, symbols can spark powerful feelings in an instant. That's not always a bad thing, but when our emotions take the wheel, well, they can steer us away from reason, even when the road signs are flashing danger ahead. So if we want to live more consciously and respond more thoughtfully, we've got to know what's pulling our strings. So with that in mind, here's your question for the week. What symbol stirs up a strong emotional response in you? And how does that response affect your ability to think clearly about the issue it represents? Why does this matter? Well, because recognizing the emotional power of a symbol gives us a chance to pause and ask, all right, wait, am I reacting or actually thinking this through? When we slow down enough to notice our reaction, we're more likely to engage with ideas critically instead of just reacting out of habit or impulse or pure emotion. For me, one of the most emotionally charged symbols out there right now is that goddamn red hat with the white text, "Make America Great Again." When I see it, my gut reaction is immediate and intense. I assume the person wearing it is a racist, hateful, closed-minded asshole. Not just misinformed, but willfully ignorant. And honestly, it's hard not to feel that way given everything that symbol has come to represent in our culture. But here's where it gets interesting. One of the guys I work with has one of those hats, though he doesn't wear it to work. And he's someone I've always known to be intelligent, kind, and genuinely caring. Now, that caused a serious moment of cognitive dissonance for me. On the one hand, I wanted to write him off completely based on that symbol. On the other, I knew this was someone I'd respected in other settings. So I decided to talk to him, really talk to him, and what I discovered surprised me. He wasn't hateful underneath, right? He wasn't cruel. What he was deeply misled by the right-wing media he was consuming every day. He didn't even realize how much of what he believed was rooted in narratives that had been carefully fed to him. And the more we talked, the more I realized that many of his core values, ideas about fairness, justice, even compassion, weren't all that different from mine. That red hat, that symbol, had kept me from seeing the real person underneath it. Now, that experience taught me something really important. Symbols can block understanding just as easily as they can create connection. And when we're triggered emotionally by a symbol, we owe it to ourselves and to others to pause, question the reaction, and see if there's more to the story. At the end of the day, emotional triggers are part of being human. But when we understand them, we don't have to be controlled by them. And that awareness can help us show up with more clarity, compassion, and conviction in a world that really needs all three. Well, before I wrap things up, I'd like to leave you with one more thought. American author and humorist Mark Twain once wrote, "Whenever you find yourself on the side of the majority, it is time to pause and reflect." I think this quote hits hard because it challenges something most of us are wired to do. Follow the crowd. Trust the familiar. Stick with our people. And that's exactly why it matters when we talk about symbols and emotional triggers. Symbols often represent the majority in a visual, visceral kind of way. Whether it's a hat, a flag, a slogan, or even a religious image, we associate it with a group. And once we do that, we often stop thinking critically. Mark Twain's advice to pause and reflect is an invitation to do something different. Instead of reacting emotionally or instinctively, we slow down. We ask ourselves, why am I feeling this way? Or what does this symbol actually mean to me and to the person using it? That kind of reflection doesn't mean we agree with harmful ideologies or that we've abandoned our values. It means we get intentional about how we respond, and it helps us to stay grounded in reason and empathy. So when you find yourself feeling fired up, whether with pride or anger because of a symbol, that's your cue. Pause, reflect, and choose your next move with clarity and purpose. All right, we've come to the end of this episode. Thanks for joining me. I'll be back again next week, but in the meantime, I encourage you to engage with our question for the week and pay attention to the important lessons you come across, wherever you find them. You'll create a more purposeful and joyful life, and you'll start to feel more connected to the world and the people around you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Mythologizing the Bible as we did a deeper dive into the readings for Easter Sunday, Cycle C of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. Remember that if we want a better future, we can't build it on stories and symbols alone. We need facts, reason, and a clear moral compass. The Bible readings used for this episode are from the Holy Bible, New International Version, NIV, copyright 1973, 1978, 1984, and 2011 by Biblica Inc., Used by permission, all rights reserved worldwide. Thank you for listening. If you like this content, please consider telling a friend about it. The more people who hear the positive messages I'm sharing, the better. Mythologizing the Bible is a live-streamed series held most Thursdays at 9 p.m. Eastern Time on twitch.tv/thecodaproject. Every week, the audio of these Mythologizing the Bible presentations is released as a podcast. You can find both the podcast and the video versions of the presentations at thecodaproject.com. CODA stands for Creating Our Divine Alignment. When we learn to align our words and actions with our core values, that alignment feels absolutely exquisite. It feels divine. But it's a divine alignment that doesn't require belief in the supernatural. It's a divine alignment we have the ability to create for ourselves. To learn more, to subscribe to my mailing list, and to keep up on everything I'm doing with the Coda Project, please visit thecodaproject.com.